Unabashed.
The most unpredictable,
Becomes a headline.
the most volatile,
Outrageous behavior.
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan and Roshan. On February 1st, the Union government presented its budget for the upcoming fiscal year, setting the tone for its midterm year as the government pivots towards 2024 and the end of its second term. What are the biggest takeaways from the budget? How did the markets receive it? And what does it tell us about India's uncertain economic recovery? To discuss these questions and much, much more, I am joined today by Roshan Kishore. Roshan is the data and political economy editor at the Hindustan Times, and he has covered this year's budget, as he does every year, in extensive detail. He is a longtime friend of the podcast, and I'm pleased to welcome him back to the show. Roshan, good to talk to you.
Hi, Milan. It's very nice to be back here.
So I want to ask you about the nitty-gritty of the budget, of course, but before we get to that, I want to ask if you could maybe provide some useful context for our listeners. You know, headed into this year's budget presentation, there were a lot of signs of recovery, some continued signs of stress, some uncertainty about oil prices, about the pandemic. How would you characterize the state of the economy headed into this budget presentation?
Milan, there are two ways to look into it. One, like you said, everybody has been talking about the fact that the Indian economy is back to pre-pandemic levels in 2021-22. Now, that is an important achievement, no doubt, because India suffered a huge contraction, around 7.3% of its GDP in the pandemic year. But I think we need to keep in mind 2-3 facts. First is that in 2019-20, that is the pre-pandemic year, India's GDP growth, now that we have the revised estimates, actually fell down to just 3.7%. That basically means that the pre-pandemic bar for the Indian economy is actually quite low. At one point of time, there was talk of India doing double-digit growth rates, and we're talking 3.7% here. That's one. Second, even with this revival above the pre-pandemic growth rates, what has not recovered to pre-pandemic levels is India's private consumption. It is more than half of India's GDP, and we know for a fact that the poor actually consume a greater share of their incomes than the rich do. So it basically means that the poor continue to suffer in the economy. Now, those are the macro numbers. Now, let us look at the more recent numbers. Last week, the RBI had its monetary policy meeting and the consumer confidence index were released. We also have some measures of business confidence. What we see today is an unprecedented divergence of sort between consumer confidence and business confidence. And then, of course, we'll talk about inflation and all that as we go. But for me, this is the biggest economic number in which you have to put the budget into context. In the Indian economy today, there's a very huge class divergence in economic system. The really well-off sections of the economy have recovered. They, in fact, seem to be doing much better than what they were before the pandemic. Whereas the bottom half, I'm afraid probably more than that of the economy, actually continues to suffer in a very big way.
So could I just push you on that a little bit, Roshan? Because, if you take everything that you've said as fact and as a given, I think government officials would still say, okay, but look at the rest of the world. India has bounced back remarkably well compared to everyone else, right? So if everyone else has been hit by the same wave, are we expecting too much for India to be such a kind of positive outlier?
Well, if one were to judge this claim on the basis of economic performance in just FY21 and FY22, I would agree with the official version of it. The problem is India has had a very prolonged slowdown even coming into the pandemic. We've discussed it earlier also on your show, where our growth right from 2016-17 to 2019-20 actually fell from 8.3% to 3.7%. Now, that pre-pandemic pain did not vanish with the pandemic. So, if the target is to manage a statistical achievement that you actually have to grow for 1 year, say at 8% and then go back to a normal growth, then yes, we are fine. But if what India is interested in, and that is the stated policy goal, that you want to situate yourself in a long-term sustainable high growth rate phase, then we have to take into account these things. Where is future growth going to come from? As long as the bottom of the economy doesn't fire, those kind of high growth rates we are not going to be able to get.
So I want to ask you about an analysis piece that you did for the Hindustan Times right after the budget came out. And in it, you wrote that this year's budget, quote, has prioritized long-term growth over short-term growth. Tell us in a nutshell what you think this government strategy was in trying to address these different cross currents and headwinds facing the economy.
Milan, after India became independent, we actually adopted a planning model of economic development. So India used to have 5-year plans. The last 5-year plan ended in 2012. Then the Modi government came in 2014, and the Planning Commission was formally abolished. This year's budget actually talks about an economic vision for the next 25 years. So 2022 is the 75th year of India's independence, and the budget officially talks about economic development goals when India completes 100 years of its independence in 2047. So that way, it's beaten even the planning model, which was considered to be a pre-reform legacy. Uh, what the budget seems to be betting on, and this is an exercise which in a way undermines the very sanctity of the budget, because the budget, essentially speaking, is about the government's annual spending and resource generation exercise. By making a 25-year long plan, which the finance minister said in her speech will overhaul India's infrastructure and therefore crowd in private investment, it's a very long term bet on growth. Like I said, when your problem is that private consumption is lagging, when your problem is that you were actually doing, say, 7.5, 8% growth rate 4 5 years ago, and you were doing 3.7 before the pandemic, and you were struggling to come back to those levels even today, private consumption will not revive by building more highways and bridges. So, in principle, there's nothing wrong with this long term vision, but I have my doubts on what exactly it will do to boost the short term growth.
But is this just a difference of visions, Roshan, between a kind of supply side and demand side economic perspective? Because a lot of people would say, look, the multiplier effects, if you invest in infrastructure, are really large. What we need to do is have, roads and ports and infrastructure that's going to create construction jobs. That's then going to spill into the service sector. And so that in the long term is much more effective than just doing cash transfers or doing rural employment guarantee or doing the usual kind of palliative measures. How would you respond to that?
I'll come to the palliative measures later, Milan, but I completely agree with the logic that government capex, compared to say revenue expenditure, has a higher multiplier. But we have to keep some numbers in mind. Uh, how big is the government's capital expenditure component compared to the overall economy? If you look at this year's numbers, and experts and analysts have questioned about what that entire number is actually new spending. It's around 4% of India's GDP, the total central government capital spending. So it's a very small component of the economy. Now, even with a significantly high multiplier effect, on its own, it's not going to say, generate momentum for the economy. And this is something which the budget completely accepts. The budget says that it hopes that this public investment will actually crowd in private investment. So in a way, the bet is on private investment. Now, what is holding back private investment in India? If you look at capacity utilization levels, they were released just before the Monetary Policy Committee meeting last week. They continue to be very low compared to pre-pandemic levels. So it is one thing to hope that the businesses will bring in more investment once the infrastructure is overhauled and all that. But as long as capacity utilization levels do not rise, which basically requires the private demand to increase, we are not going to go to a high growth path immediately. I wrote it in one of my columns before the budget. That it what the government is hoping is claiming that the Indian economy by its capex push will actually win a race like the marathon. But you can't be losing momentum in the short run and hoping to win a marathon. For that to happen, you actually have to focus on what will drive short run growth in the economy. There, the budget has a problem. There's nothing wrong with the long term vision, but that vision may get jeopardized if the short run growth keeps on going down.
So I think the natural follow-on question for you, Roshan, is, okay, obviously the government has to be able to do multiple things at one time. It can invest in long-term growth. It can invest in capex. At the same time, it has to deal with a short-term problem with demand and consumption, and the fact that the poor and less well-off have been really hit very hard, right, by this quote-unquote K-shaped recovery. What are some of the things economists are saying the government should have done in terms of taking more aggressive steps to stimulate demand?
To be fair to the government, it's a difficult situation. I'll give 2 3 examples. Now, what did the budget not do? What it did was a huge focus on capex. It actually bets on manufacturing, the stock of special economic zones and all that. What it did not do was programs such as the NREGS, food subsidy, etc. have actually seen a cut. What it did not do was social sector spending has been maintained at low levels in order to make room for capital spending. Now, I am not for a second undermining the importance of programs such as the NREGS or social sector spending in India. They actually played a very important role in preventing large-scale distress during the pandemic. But these, Milan, like you said, are palliative measures. If you put money in these schemes, you will actually prevent large-scale distress. You will not see starvation deaths in the country. You will not see people going through absolute penury. But this cannot be expected to boost the Indian economy's growth potential. It cannot take you from, say, 4% to 8% growth rate. I think the larger problem is, and this is not a question which this budget alone could have addressed. Even before the pandemic, like you said, it's a supply side versus a demand side debate. The Indian economy had been in a slowdown, and the government's approach to that slowdown was, I think basically it was in a denial mode because there was no serious effort to engage with the reasons of the slowdown, and it kept on saying that the economy has bottomed out and will start recovering. My view of the issue has been that slowdown is a result of the policy-driven squeeze on informal sector in the Indian economy. It started with demonetization, gained more momentum with goods and services tax, and what we have been witnessing is a progressive squeeze on the informal sector in the economy. That sector actually caters to the largest amount of poor people. I would rather say the non-rich people in this country, and therefore gives incomes to people who have a very high marginal propensity to consume. If the Indian economy has to regain its growth potential, independent economists, for example, Pranjul Bhandari has written on it. She said that a forced approach to formalization can generate headwinds for economic growth. I think there has to be a reversal on that front. It's not a question of putting ₹1 trillion more in NREGS or food subsidy. Unless we are able to prevent that policy squeeze on informal sector, reverse it, we are not going to see a revival in Indian economy's growth fortune.
Roshan, I think here what the government would say is that there are short-term costs associated with things like the goods and services tax. There are costs associated with the insolvency and bankruptcy code. There are costs associated with digitization of the economy. But over time, you're going to start to see real benefits, right? You're going to start to see social protection improve. You're going to start to see, whether it's the tax net or revenue collection, start to improve. And so I guess the question is, how do you judge the trade-off between the short-term pain and the long-term gain?
Well, Milan, like Keynes said, in the long run, we're all dead. No, I think, in principle, one can have a debate on these lines. The problem is, the government's long term, seems to be getting prolonged because remember, they started in 2016-17. We are already in 22-23. It has not come. Number two, it is very difficult in India to have an informed debate on these issues because and there the blame squarely lies on the government. We do not have consumption expenditure data in this country after 2011-12. A report came for 17-18. It was scrapped by the government. That report actually showed that real consumption had fallen for the first time in independent India.
Right, and that was a big bombshell when the leaked report.
We do not have a latest survey of informal sector enterprises in this country. That is actually a very important input into calculation of GDP statistics because that is how you extrapolate the informal sector incomes into the GDP. The last survey was done in 2015-16, which is before demonetization and GST. Unless these numbers are brought out in the open, unless we know how exactly these things have changed, after these policies, which actually are supposed to have hurt the informal sector in a big way, we cannot have an informal debate. The government has been throwing statistics at us, but those statistics have no comparable metrics in the pre-demonetization, pre-GST phase. So it is very difficult to take those, claims on face value. And this, I think, the longer the government delays, we do not even have a census in this country. It's 2022 today. And, India has never delayed its census since 1881. The census also is actually a big source of a lot of important indicators. So unless the government, expedites the process of publishing these very crucial statistical information, about the economy, most independent analysts have a very good reason to sort of, be skeptical of what the government has been claiming. I mean, we have reason to doubt its intent.
Very fair point. One of the things that we do have data on are new investment flows, CapEx projects, bank non-performing assets. Since the early part of the previous decade, economists have been worried about this twin balance sheet problem, right? That is, you have these banks weighed down by non-performing assets. high levels of indebtedness facing large firms, especially those in the infrastructure domain. These are things that we can actually track over time. As we look towards a new fiscal year, how concerned are you that these lingering issues from the kind of pre-COVID era are going to continue to plague the recovery in the post-COVID era?
As far as the question of twin balance sheet crisis is concerned, Milan, I think one can say with a reasonable degree of confidence, I mean, there's no predicting the future perfectly, that the worst is behind us now. It is another question of issue that, there's a significant amount of money which is still caught in bank frauds and all that. And one has to see how the IBC deals with that. But both bank balance sheets and corporate balance sheets are in a good shape. Private bankers have been on record saying that we are actually willing to lend, but nobody's coming to borrow. We have seen during the pandemic that some of the biggest corporations in India, they've actually retired their debt rather than take fresh debt. So rather than making fresh investment, companies such as Reliance have actually been retiring their debt. I think the problem with the Indian economy today and what it was immediately after the 2008 global financial crisis, which is when the origins of the twin balance sheet crisis came into being, is that then the Indian economy was what you call an overheated economy. There was irrational exuberance, and that ultimately contributed to the buildup of bad loans, etc. Today, the Indian economy is not overheated by any stretch of imagination. The problem is the bears seem to have taken over. If you look at CMI data on capex, for example, private capex, at least the new capital, project announcements, which is what is the most important, metric of market sentiment, etc., seems to be doing rather badly compared to, say, the past levels. So the problem today is not whether banks have the money to lend it or whether corporates have that space on their balance sheets. If you look at metrics such as the interest coverage ratio, things have actually improved. Today, the Indian economy's problem is, do corporates, large companies even feel the need to take money from banks to make fresh investments? Capacity utilization levels tell us that actually that might not be the case. About the small enterprises, the MSME, which are the crucial sectors for the employment generation in the country, we actually don't know for a fact. If we had that informal sector data, we would be in a much better position to say that.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners, thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. So, Roshan, we've been talking about what was in the budget, what's been left out of the budget. One of the things many economists would have liked to have seen is some kind of fiscal consolidation roadmap for the medium term. Now, there's a big debate about this as well. At a time when consumption is so depressed, investment needs a fill-up. Some analysts have said, look, we economists are obsessing too much over the fiscal deficit numbers. It's not a priority right now. We have to get growth going again. How would you respond to this?
In principle, Milan, there are two ways to look at the question of fiscal consolidation. You can either track the numerator, which is, say, the question of how much fiscal deficit in absolute terms you incur, what is going to be the level of your national debt, etc. Or you start tracking the denominator, which is fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP or national debt as a percentage of GDP at any given point of time. I think the sensible way to do it for a country like India is at a time when you actually had a slowdown even before the pandemic for 3-4 years and you actually suffered a contraction. What India should be doing is tracking its numerator. The only way to effectively manage the fiscal situation is to make sure that you actually get on a high growth path. There, I think the government has taken a sensible approach, that it has not undertaken fiscal consolidation in a very sudden manner. And when I say this, we have to remember that this does not mean that the fiscal impulse to the Indian economy is increasing. It is actually going down, because we have actually come from, say, a 9% fiscal deficit to a 6.4% fiscal deficit level. So, yes, the fiscal stimulus is being withdrawn. The fiscal situation would have been much worse had it not been for, say, around ₹1 trillion of extra cushion, which the government has collected in taxes from petrol and diesel. Remember, petrol diesel prices in India are at an all-time high, even though crude prices, they're now in the 90 range. But petrol diesel prices, when they were frozen in November, they were much lower than what they were during the UPA 2 years. So yes, I think it's a sensible strategy to prioritize growth over immediate fiscal consolidation. But it does not mean that no, I mean this very large fiscal stimulus at play in the Indian economy at the moment.
So I want to ask you a little bit about India and the world. The economist Poonam Gupta highlighted a couple of areas where the government may have missed an opportunity. And one of the things that she said in a piece in the Economic Times, and we'll link to that, is that in order to foster growth at rates much higher than in the past, India needs a vision to integrate itself into these global value chains, right? But if you look at the budget and you read the speech, there's a lot in there about self-reliance, about strengthening domestic manufacturing, about indigenization in the defense sector, for instance. Do you think that India is headed in the wrong direction in this front at a time when it should be integrating itself into the world? It is turning inward?
It's a vexed issue, Milan. For example, today, Raghuram Rajan and Rohit Lamba have an opinion piece out where they actually say that India should not even be pursuing the manufacturing or say the China objective anymore, and our strength lies in services. There's been a lot of criticism on the question which you raised. Arvind Subramaniam has been writing extensively about it, that our duty structure has actually been inverted. It sort of defeats the purpose. No, I would say, I think to have an informed opinion on this question, I mean, it requires a lot of research, which is beyond my journalistic capabilities. But I would state two, three basic points. I think historically we know that no country has actually managed a successful economic transition into a middle income status without having a manufacturing revolution. So the need for India giving a boost to its manufacturing actually, I think is still valid. Uh, Economic history, even in the post Second World War period, actually also tells us that countries have not had manufacturing revolutions with a hands-off approach by policy or government. Whether we look at South Korea, other Southeast Asian countries, government policy has played a role. Now, even countries such as the United States are actually talking about an industrial policy. I think, personally speaking, I will always be in favor of a hands-on policy approach rather than say, a completely laissez-faire kind of an arrangement. Does it mean what India is doing is exactly right? Frankly speaking, I said I do not know. The budget had a lot of custom duty announcement. There was talk about reviving, the special economic zone discussion in India and all that. Raghuram Rajan, for example, and Rohit Lamba in the piece, they say that we do not know whether these perks, these incentives are going to, enterprises which are worthy of these concessions, or they are being managed politically, to people who are close to the regime. We know in India's political economy structure that the latter is a possibility which cannot be ruled out. You yourself have been talking about the kind of increasing opacity in political finance in this country. So it's a very slippery path. It is a path where there's a very thin line between trying to promote domestic manufacturing and either encouraging cartels or giving artificial support to uncompetitive manufacturing. For example, Milan, India backed out of the RCEP negotiations last year after having negotiated for a very long time. Politically, the decision was sold as something which was pro-farmer. But we know for a fact that Indian manufacturing, even today, is not, it cannot live up to the kind of competition which RCEP would have brought to it. So we have a very difficult problem here. I would think that the way to handle this is still some sort of a hands-on policy question. Whether this approach is exactly right or not, I am not in a position to say.
Fair enough. Let me kind of pivot, though, by asking you just a second about the global scenario. There are a lot of potential headwinds out there. We're hearing a lot in the United States and Europe, elsewhere, about rising inflation, rising oil prices, you already mentioned. And, we should just mention there's a lot of uncertainty still left about COVID. People think we've maybe managed this Omicron surge, but we don't know what comes next. Could you tell us a little bit about what trends going on in the world Indian policymakers should be paying attention to? What are some of the assumptions that the government is making that could be undercut if there's some kind of exogenous shock somewhere else?
Let's go back 6-7 years, Milan. I think around 2015, when the Delhi Assembly elections were taking place, Prime Minister Modi, in a political speech in Delhi, actually said that by electing the BJP and me as Prime Minister, you've actually brought good fortunes on yourself because crude oil prices have fallen to around $45 per barrel. Go back to those times. Crude was below $50 per barrel. Interest rates in the United States after the taper scare were actually back to practically zero once again. it created a very favorable situation for a country like India. Because when crude prices go up, India is hit from three sides. The fiscal deficit goes up because you politically it's suicidal to sort of increase prices. Your current account gets hit because India imports 80% of its energy requirements, and inflation starts increasing at a very fast rate. The money, the practically zero interest rate regime in the United States and advanced countries has actually been very good for the Indian stock markets. Even during COVID, you saw that the Indian stock markets actually made very handsome recovery. Our price equity ratio even today is among the highest among major economies. A lot of people made a lot of money in the stock markets, and that money actually reflects in consumption decisions in the economy, whether the super rich are buying the second house during COVID and all that. Those good times are clearly over. Oil's not going to go back to $50 per barrel anytime soon. Most people actually say that it'll never go back to those kind of prices because more fresh investments are actually going to go into renewables. Interest rates are going to be increasing. How much is a question which probably we'll have to see. But there's no going back to those kind of low interest rate regimes. So it means that the tailwinds which the Indian economy enjoyed from those sides are over. Now, the budget says that crude prices are expected to be between $70 to $75. Right now, if I would love to know your take on what's happening to the Russia-Ukraine thing, because if that goes for a toss, then we have no idea where oil prices will go. Once interest rate starts rising, a lot of money which used to come to Indian stock markets, a lot of money which actually came to the Indian startup ecosystem, because remember, these were venture capitalist funds who were getting negative returns in the country. So they had nothing better rather than put this money in emerging markets, etc. Those kind of tailwinds are going to dissipate. What exactly will their effect be? We don't know. But we know for a fact that the tide has turned.
So, Roshan, let me kind of end this conversation by asking you a little bit about kind of India's trend growth rate. Many economists have said ad nauseum in your paper and many others that, what India really needs to address its severe developmental needs is a sustained trend growth rate north of 70% for many years to come. I'm wondering, what is the consensus today about where India's trend growth rate is? And for it to nudge higher, what sorts of changes or reforms do you think are needed?
Well, in the World Economic Outlook released October last year, the IMF said that it sees India's potential growth rate at 6% now, which was a reduction of 25 basis points from 6.25. So that's one. I think, in India, like you said, the policy response has been that we are still world's fastest growing economy. We will go back to doing 8%, 9% growth rate, from next year. So the government is still not willing to accept that there's been some long-term damage to the Indian economy, either from its forced formalization policies or the pandemic. Because we do not have independent data from sources such as the Consumption Expenditure Survey, the Informal Sector Survey, etc., it's difficult to, if you want to predict India's trend growth, there has to be some quantitative modeling exercise. I unfortunately, it's beyond my capabilities to do that. But the larger question I think you seem to be asking is, do we fear that there's been a damage to India's long-term growth potential? I think there's a very large share of economists in India who would actually agree to that question. If you see the Monetary Policy Committee meetings, MPC minutes, for example, economists have been saying that the reason monetary policy has been unable to sort of push India's growth rate even before the pandemic, etc., is that it can actually help a cyclical problem. It can't help a structural problem. I think for the government to start acting on this issue, there has to be a recognition of the fact that if there's been damage, why did the damage occur in the first place? The government's vision, like is evident from the budget, is that the way for the Indian economy to go forward is to build more infrastructure, integrate more successfully with global value chains, and then we'll actually at some point of time achieve the China trajectory, where we'd have gleaming highways from factories to ports, and we will actually have a greater share of export markets. The question is, the basic assumption that is the global economy going to allow somebody like a China and that kind of access to their markets even true today? I personally think that it does not hold today. A lot of economists, I think, would agree. Then the question comes as to how do you then support growth? I think one, it has to be inward looking. Export, there's still a lot of scope for improving India's labor intensive exports and all that. But the basic boost to growth has to come from inward looking policy. And I think, say the top 20% of, India has actually done very well. The best way and the most sustainable way to boost growth is to actually, encourage the income and consumption of the bottom 70%, 60% in India. If you ask me personally, the best way to do that would be in India, if there's one thing the rich actually, the poor actually outspend themselves on, it's education. The pandemic has taught us that it can be health. So if the government, the capex focus is justified, it probably will have long-term returns. But if the government were to find a way, if it were to find the conviction to sort of, help poor people mitigate their health and education spending, and that money, if it could be diverted towards, say, more consumption goods, durable consumer goods, and that kind of stuff, we would actually see some sort of a permanent boost to growth. The problem is India's political economy has actually gone in a direction where more and more state governments, and our friend Nilanjan Sarkar and Yamini have actually written about it very beautifully. More and more state governments are actually feeling compelled to throw what I would say, very unproductive doles, such as, you give, say, 20,000 rupees to a girl student who's just completed graduation and things like that, rather than make this sustained spending in social sector investment, which will actually take care of long-term growth of the Indian economy. This is something the finance secretary also talked about in an interview. He said today state governments in India are extremely reluctant to do capital spending on most sectors. So India has to, the challenge of boosting India's long-term growth cannot bypass its larger political economy angle. And if we keep competing on the welfare route, which is basically which government is going to give how much disposable money to people just like that, no strings attached, I see very little hope.
My guest on the show this week is Roshan Kishore. He is the data and political economy editor of the Hindustan Times. He has looked into all the nooks and crannies of this year's budget so that you don't have to. Roshan, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us and with our listeners.
Thanks a lot, Milan.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com, India's fastest growing podcasting platform. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. Helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we reference on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Production assistance comes from Caroline Duckworth, Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Cliff Jayapranada is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.